The summer of 1944 was supposed to be the beginning of the end. American soldiers had crossed the English Channel, fought their way onto the beaches of Normandy under fire, and paid for every yard of French soil with their lives. They had expected that once they shattered the Atlantic Wall and broke into the open country beyond, the road east would open before them. Commanders had planned for it. Logistical systems had been built around it. The men who had come ashore on June 6th had survived that morning, believing that the worst was behind them. It was not. What waited for them beyond the beaches was something far more punishing than the fortifications at the waterline. What waited for them was the bocage. The hedgerows of Normandy are not easy to describe to someone who has never encountered them. They are ancient earthen walls, some of them raised over many centuries of farming, packed with the root systems of mature trees and dense thorned brush, rising 2 to 3 meters above the sunken lanes that pass between them. They divide the landscape into a labyrinth of small enclosed fields, each one its own isolated world of grass and shadow and compressed sightlines. Men moving through one of those lanes could not see beyond the next hedgerow. They could not know what was waiting in the field on the other side. They could not be warned by aerial reconnaissance or distant artillery observers, because even aircraft directly overhead could not penetrate the summer canopy to see into those fields below. Every lane was a funnel. Every field enclosed a potential kill zone. A small number of well-positioned defenders with machine guns and mortars could hold one of those enclosed spaces against a force many times their number until the ammunition ran out or the position was flanked after hours of blood and effort. The men defending those fields had prepared every one of them. German soldiers from the Panzer Division, the 2nd Panzer Division, and the various parachute formations deployed in Normandy had spent weeks reinforcing their positions before the Americans arrived in force. They had dug firing positions into the earthen walls of the hedgerows at ground level, invisible until they opened fire. They had positioned machine guns to cover every lane from enfilading angles that made direct return fire from men in the lane nearly impossible. They had pre-registered mortar and artillery fire on every predictable avenue of approach, so that the moment American infantry was funneled into a lane, the defenders could call for fire on coordinates they had already calculated. They had wired the approach routes, planted mines in the gateways between fields, and turned the ancient agricultural landscape into a defensive system of extraordinary depth and resilience. An attacking unit that managed to clear one field and force its way through one hedgerow found itself facing another field, another wall of earth and root and shadow, and the whole process beginning again from the start. The American tactical problem in the bocage was not simply getting past one hedgerow. It was getting past hundreds of them in sequence, under fire, with a casualty rate that rose with every field crossed. Inside that landscape, the American soldier in the summer of 1944 faced a problem that no one had fully anticipated and no one had adequately solved before the first man died from it. When a rifle platoon moved through one of those sunken lanes with Sherman tanks rolling behind them, the tank crews were sealed inside their vehicles, cut off from the outside world by a combination of steel, engine noise, and the fundamental limitation of narrow periscopes that showed each crewman a slice of terrain rather than a coherent picture of the battle. An infantryman who spotted a threat, who needed to redirect the tank's fire, who needed to warn the crew of an anti-tank team emerging from the undergrowth 20 meters away, had no reliable means of making himself heard. A Sherman tank buttoned up for combat was, in a real sense, fighting half-blind. The 5 crew members each had limited fields of view through their respective vision devices, positioned mainly for forward observation. The tank commander in his cupola had the best overall view, but even he could see only within a narrow arc directly ahead and to the sides. The terrain directly behind the tank, the close ground on which German anti-tank teams favored operating, was largely invisible to the crew. German soldiers had learned that the Sherman's most vulnerable zones were its flanks and rear, where the armor was thinner and the crew's observation was worst. They had developed tactics that exploited this, using ditches and hedgerow shadows to approach within a few meters of a tank before striking with a shaped charge weapon. The infantrymen covering the tank's rear could see those approaches. The crew could not. Without a means of communication between the two, the tank was vulnerable to threats that the men protecting it could identify in advance, but had no way to report in time for the crew to respond. The infantryman's options when he needed to warn the crew were limited and dangerous. He could sprint through fire to the rear of the tank and beat on the hull with his rifle butt or his helmet, hoping someone inside felt the vibration and interpreted it correctly. He could run to the front of the vehicle and wave his arms in front of the driver's vision port, standing in direct line with any fire coming from the direction of the enemy. He could fire a colored smoke canister and hope the tank commander happened to be looking through the right periscope at precisely the right moment and understood what the smoke was intended to mean. He could send a runner back through the fire to find the tank platoon leader and relay the information up the chain of command and back down to the individual crew, a process that might take 10 minutes while the tactical situation resolved itself in 10 seconds. Or he could watch what happened next. What happened next, in those weeks of fighting through the Norman hedgerows in June and July of 1944, produced a casualty list that shook the American High Command to its foundations. A wartime survey of rifle companies that fought in the Bocage found that some units in the Saint-Lô sector had lost more than half their enlisted strength and roughly 68% of their officers in a matter of play. Platoons that had landed in June with 40 men were down to 15 within weeks, and the replacements arriving to fill the gaps often became casualties themselves before they had learned what the men around them had already paid to know. The tanks and the infantry were fighting beside each other without ever truly fighting together. And at the most fundamental level, the cause was that they had no reliable means of communication in the moments when communication was the difference between coordinated action and mutual catastrophe. The solution, when it finally came, was so straightforward that its long delay remains one of the more troubling institutional failures of the Second World War. It was a standard United States Army field telephone, the model designated the EE-8, the same rugged hand-cranked instrument used by signal platoons throughout the Army to run wire communications between command posts in every theater of the war. It was already present in large numbers in the supply system. It weighed less than 3 kilograms in its carrying case. It required no special training to operate. It was designed to withstand field conditions and had been doing so since before the war. The modification needed to convert it into a tank infantry communication device required no specialized engineering and no factory. It required an ammunition can, a drill, a grommet, and a short length of field wire. A soldier took a standard metal ammunition can of the type used to store belted 30-caliber machine gun rounds, welded or bolted it to the rear hull of a Sherman tank at a height a crouching man could reach from behind cover, and placed an EE-8 handset inside on a short length of field wire. The wire passed through a small hole drilled and grommeted through the steel hull, ran inside the fighting compartment, and connected to the tank's internal interphone amplifier, the same circuit that linked the 5 crew positions to each other. The ammunition can protected the handset from rain, mud, shell fragments, and the general violence of armored combat. When an infantryman behind the tank picked up the handset and turned the magneto, a ringing signal reached every crew station simultaneously. The driver heard it, the gunner heard it, the loader heard it. The assistant driver and the commander heard it. Any of them could lift their headset microphone and answer. For the first time in the European theatre, a rifleman crouching in the mud of Normandy could speak directly to the man in the turret of the machine beside him, in plain words, in real time. Without a chain of command between them, the phone was mounted at the rear of the hull, so that the infantryman using it was sheltered behind the tank's own armor, shielded from frontal fire by the same steel plate that protected the crew inside. The man behind the hull became the tank's eyes in the terrain that periscopes and vision blocks could not reach. He could describe a target in plain language, give a direction, estimate a range in meters, and describe whether the threat was stationary or moving. The tank could respond before the situation changed. Together, the tank and the foot soldier beside it formed something that neither could be operating alone. The tank brought armor and a main gun that could destroy a reinforced position in a single shot. The infantryman brought close observation of terrain the crew could not see, the ability to identify targets the periscopes missed, and the presence of a human voice that turned the sealed steel box into something that listened. To understand what the phone meant to the men who used it, it is necessary to stand for a moment inside the experience of infantry combat in the Bocage before the phone arrived. A rifle platoon numbered roughly 40 men. In the hedgerow country, those men moved through lanes, sometimes barely wide enough for 2 soldiers abreast, unable to see more than a few meters to either side, the summer vegetation pressing close on both banks. The tank crews following them were professional soldiers, trained and willing. The infantry beside them were the same, but they were operating in separate worlds, connected only by proximity and gesture in conditions where a misunderstanding resolved itself in seconds, and the consequences were permanent. The young men who went into those fields understood the risk of combat. What they had not been fully prepared for was dying, because no one had provided a reliable means of warning the machine fighting next to them. They had watched Shermans burn in Norman lanes because the crew never saw the close assault team that the infantrymen 50 meters behind had tracked across 2 fields. They had seen infantry platoons raked by their own supporting tank's bow machine gun, because the crew could not distinguish the crouching soldiers at the hedgerows base from the enemy beyond it. They had lost friends on both sides of the hull, and they understood with the precision of men who had earned the knowledge exactly what the silence between them was costing. Junior officers who commanded rifle platoons in the hedgerow fighting aged years in a matter of weeks. They learned to distrust any plan that assumed coordination between infantry and armor would happen without deliberate preparation, because the failure of that coordination had killed people under their command. They learned to spend the hours before an attack establishing the hand signals, the smoke codes, and the wire connections that might allow them to communicate with the tank crews they were counting on, because the official system had proven itself inadequate before enough men died to make the lesson indelible. Many of them carried those lessons into the rest of the war and afterward into the peacetime army, where they taught them to the next generation of officers. The phone was the physical artifact of that teaching, but the deeper lesson was about preparation, about insisting that the systems required for effective combined arms be in place before the shooting started, rather than improvised after the first casualties arrived. The mothers and fathers and wives waiting at home received telegrams that said their son had been killed in action in France. They were not told about radio frequency incompatibilities or the acoustic environment inside a fighting vehicle. They did not know that a field telephone in a metal box might have changed the outcome of the engagement in the lane where their soldier died. That knowledge came later, through the accounts of veterans and the studies of historians. By the time it was fully assembled, the men who needed it most were already buried in the fields they had fought to take. By the summer of 1944, the war in Europe had entered a phase whose outcome was increasingly visible to anyone who could read a map without bias. The invasion of Normandy on June 6th had committed the Western Allies to a ground campaign of enormous scale. Soviet forces in the east were preparing what would become Operation Bagration, the summer offensive that would eventually shatter the German Army Group Center along a front of more than 400 kilometers, the largest single ground operation of the entire war. In Italy, Allied forces had entered Rome on June 4th. Germany was being compressed from 3 directions simultaneously, and the pressures were only increasing. But the German army had not broken. It had chosen its defensive ground in Normandy with care, and the bocage gave the defense every advantage the terrain offered. Artillery and air power, the 2 areas where American strength was most concentrated, both required clear observation and room to maneuver that the hedgerow country denied at every turn. The infantry divisions bearing the main weight of the advance were meeting a determined and experienced enemy in terrain that neutralized American advantages and rewarded the skills of defenders who had been fighting since 1930. 9. The First Army's rate of progress was dangerously slow. The casualty rates were unsustainable, and the breakthrough that General Omar Bradley needed to unlock the strategic potential of the invasion had not come. The bocage was holding, and the price of holding it was being paid entirely by the men in the fields. American armored doctrine had been shaped by organizational decisions made at the beginning of the war. When Congress established the armored force as a separate branch in 1940, the decision concentrated America's armored expertise in large armored divisions designed for exploitation and pursuit in open country, rather than the methodical, close-in work of infantry support. Infantry divisions received their tank support from separate battalions held at the army level as pool assets, attached to divisions as operational needs arose. These battalions rarely trained with the divisions they would eventually support. They arrived as strangers to the men beside them, without the shared procedures, hand signals, radio frequencies, and mutual understanding that effective combined arms demanded, and that could not be built quickly under fire. Every new attachment required a learning period, and in the bocage, that tuition was measured in lives. The radio architecture deepened this organizational problem in a way that had no simple remedy. American armor and American infantry operated on radio frequency bands that were entirely incompatible with each other. Armored units used the SCR-508 and related sets in the 20 to 27.9 MHz range on frequency modulation. Infantry units carried the SCR-300 backpack radio, operating in the 40 to 48 MHz range, a completely separate portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. An infantry squad leader equipped with his assigned radio could not reach the tank 30 meters behind him regardless of what he said or how he said it. The SCR-5, 36 handy-talkie, carried at the squad level operated on yet another band and was severely degraded by the electromagnetic interference generated by the tank's own electrical systems at close range. No radio either man had been issued could bridge the gap between them. The noise environment inside a buttoned-up Sherman ensured that external sound was functionally irrelevant in any case. Engine noise in the fighting compartment while moving ran continuously at 80 to 90 decibels, roughly equivalent to standing beside operating heavy machinery without pause or relief. Layered on that baseline were the steel-on-steel clatter of the track links, the whine of the hydraulic turret traverse, and the general vibration of 30 tons of moving steel over the rutted ground of Norman lanes. When the 75mm main gun fired, the sound inside the fighting compartment was sufficient to impair hearing for minutes afterward. The crew communicated through headsets tied into the interphone system. They were, in every acoustic sense, as isolated from the men outside as if they had been on a different battlefield. The improvised solutions that developed in place of a proper answer were dangerous and unreliable. Banging on the hull required running across ground under fire, and even when the crew felt the vibration through the steel, they could extract no tactical information from it beyond the general awareness that someone was back there. Signal smoke and pyrotechnic flares required the commander to be looking through the right aperture at the right moment, and to have previously agreed with the infantry on what each color meant, an agreement established inconsistently and rarely surviving first contact. Physical gesturing required exposing the signaling soldier to direct fire. And the runner, which Field Manual 1736, published in March of 1944, just 3 months before the Normandy invasion, still listed among the primary methods of tank infantry communication, required an unbroken sequence of events so slow and so vulnerable to disruption that it was essentially useless in the contact conditions the bocage produced. Every improvised method shared the same fundamental failure. They required the tactical situation to pause while communication caught up to it. In the bocage, the tactical situation never paused. The origin of the external tank telephone in the European theatre traces to the 743rd Tank Battalion and to one night in the last days of June of 1944. The battalion had landed on Omaha Beach on the morning of June 6th with the first assault waves. Its commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel John S. Upham, was wounded on Omaha Beach that morning and evacuated. Major William D. Duncan, who had been serving as the battalion's operations officer and had been temporarily assigned to train crews in England at the time of the landing, assumed command and led the battalion through the difficult weeks that followed. The battalion was attached to the 30th Infantry Division on June 14th and was in the hedgerow fighting within days, experiencing the same coordination failures that were draining the First Army's infantry companies of their strength and their experienced leaders. The battalion's officers had watched attacks fail because the tanks and infantry could not exchange information at the moment of contact. They had seen crews make decisions based on the fragmentary view through their periscopes, decisions that cost lives because the soldiers 70 meters behind could see what the crew could not and had no way to say so in time. According to the account preserved by veterans of the battalion and by the families of those who served in it, Duncan assigned the problem to a staff officer who had carried over a background from the Signal Corps. Working overnight in the field with equipment drawn from the battalion's own signal stores, that officer took a standard EE-8 field telephone, placed it in a 30 caliber metal ammunition can, passed a short field wire from the handset through a grommeted hole in the side of the can, bolted the assembly to the rear hull of a Sherman, and ran the wire through a hole drilled in the hull into the fighting compartment, where it connected to the interphone amplifier. When a soldier outside cranked the magneto, every crew station in the tank rang simultaneously. Any crewman could answer. A two-way voice conversation between the man on the ground and any member of the crew could proceed in real time. The prototype was done before dawn. a staff officer took the modified tank to 30th Infantry Division headquarters. The officers who examined it understood immediately what had been built. The design travelled from the 30th Division through the 19th Corps to 1st Army headquarters. Units across the theatre were directed to fabricate their own installations using the same basic approach. Within approximately 30 days of that first prototype, the EE-8 in an ammunition can was standard equipment in the separate tank battalions of the United States First Army. No procurement request, no factory. No months of evaluation, 30 days from prototype to theatre-wide adoption, because the solution fit the problem precisely and required nothing that was not already on hand. The nature of the change that the phone produced was not simply tactical, it was relational. Before the phone, infantry and armour operated according to a kind of wary coexistence, each element aware of the other but unable to build the moment-to-moment trust that effective combined arms required. Tank commanders made decisions based on what they could see through their periscopes, and hoped the infantry around them would keep pace without requiring guidance from inside the hull. Infantry commanders planned their routes and objectives with the awareness that the tanks beside them might or might not respond to a threat before the infantry paid the price for it. The phone changed the character of that relationship. It introduced a continuous channel through which real-time information could flow in both directions. The infantryman behind the hull could tell the gunner which tree line to watch. The tank commander could tell the infantry to hold in place while the main gun dealt with the next position. The conversation was brief, tactical, and specific, the kind of exchange that two soldiers fighting together needed, and that no system before the phone had allowed them to have. Those who survived the bocage fighting and later reflected on it described the phone not simply as a piece of equipment, but as the difference between fighting alongside an ally and fighting with one. There is an important distinction between those two things. Fighting alongside someone means occupying the same ground and sharing the same general objective. Fighting with someone means that each man's actions are shaped by what the other can see and say in real time. Before the phone, the first was possible, the second was not. After the phone it was, and men who experienced both conditions remembered the difference for the rest of their lives. The first major documented combat operation using the modification came at Hill 192 on July 11th and 12th of 1944. The hill dominated the approaches to Saint-Lô and had been held by German paratroopers from the 3rd Parachute Division under General Lieutenant Richard Schimpf, who defended it with the tenacity that characterized German airborne units throughout the Normandy campaign. The assault was made by the 38th Infantry Regiment of the 2nd Infantry Division, commanded by Colonel Ralph W. Zwicker, with the 741st Tank Battalion in close support. The attacking units had used the weeks before the assault for deliberate preparation, establishing shared procedures and wiring the phones to the tank interphone circuits so that infantry and armour had practiced together before they fought together. When the assault went in behind a massive rolling artillery preparation, the infantrymen and the tankers could communicate in real time throughout the action. The hill fell after fierce fighting, and the combination of prepared tank infantry communication and the weight of the artillery support contributed directly to the success where earlier assaults on similar terrain had failed at far greater cost. The significance of Hill 192 was not only tactical. It was the first time since the landing that an American combined arms assault had proceeded with the tank crews and the infantry communicating continuously and directly throughout the action, adjusting fire on targets neither element could have engaged alone, and doing it in the compressed time and close terrain of the bocage. The 5 weeks between D-Day and that assault had cost the First Army something close to 40,000 casualties. The hill, with its combination of prepared phone communications and deliberate pre-assault training between the armour and the infantry, showed what those weeks had also taught, which was that the telephone on the back of the tank was not an experiment or a temporary expedient. It was a permanent feature of the way American combined arms teams would fight for the rest of the war. The question that honest history must eventually confront is why the problem persisted for 2 years before it was solved overnight by men in the field. Officers returning from North Africa in 1942 and 1943 had submitted after-action reports, noting the communication gap between tanks and dismounted infantry. Those reports had reached the training commands. They had been reviewed, acknowledged, and filed. The field manual published in March of 1944, 3 months before the Normandy invasion, and still listed runners among the primary methods. The institutional process for converting a recognized problem into a standardized solution operated at a pace measured in years. The men in the bocage were operating on a timeline measured in seconds. The gap between those two timelines was paid for in the currency of infantry lives. The organizational structure was part of the explanation. A tank battalion that had never trained with the infantry division it would support arrived in theatre without the mutual familiarity that effective combined arms required. The phone addressed the technological gap. It could not address the relational gap, which is why the post-war recommendation to permanently integrate tank units into infantry divisions was the companion lesson that the experience of the bocage made unavoidable. The challenge of communicating between infantry and armor in combat was not unique to the United States Army. Every major combatant in World War II faced some version of it, and each arrived at a different answer. German accounts compiled for the United States Army Historical Division after the war are instructive for what they describe and equally for what they do not. None of the senior German commanders who wrote about Normandy and the breakout specifically identified the external telephone as the mechanism behind American combined arms effectiveness. They could not have, because the phone was not visible to them from the other side of a firefight. What they did describe in detail was the observable effect. The speed with which American tank infantry teams responded to ambushes, the apparent ability of attacking American forces to suppress one threat while maneuvering against another, the difficulty of using close assault techniques that had been effective against American armor in earlier campaigns, when the supporting infantry now seemed consistently able to detect the approach of an anti-tank team and alert the crew in time to respond. The German tactical literature on Normandy reflects bewilderment at the coordination of American responses. The phone was the answer to that bewilderment, and it was invisible by design, because it did its work through a handset in an ammunition can on the back of a tank, and its conversation was heard only by the two men who needed to hear it. Germany had built its preferred solution into the vehicle from the start. The armoured half-track carried a radio set operating on the same frequency network as the tanks it accompanied, so that a Panzer Grenadier platoon leader in a half-track could speak directly to a tank commander without any modification or field expedient. The communication was designed into the vehicle architecture, and the doctrine was built around that capability. The limitation was production. By September of 1943, roughly 11.5% of German Panzer Grenadier battalions were fully equipped with armoured half-tracks. The remaining 88.5% moved by truck, which could not keep pace with tanks across broken terrain and offered no radio integration with the armour. Panzer Lehr Division, which Fritz Bayerlein commanded in Normandy, was exceptional in having all four of its Panzer Grenadier battalions mounted in armoured half-tracks, making it the only German division in the Normandy theatre that fully realized this concept in practice. For the great majority of the German army, the theoretical advantage of the Panzer Grenadier system existed primarily on paper, and infantry armor coordination in the field often suffered from difficulties comparable to those the Americans experienced. The Soviet army chose the most direct approach. Soviet doctrine, codified in the 1942 combat regulations, solved the communication problem by placing infantry soldiers physically on the outside of the tank, riding into battle in the practice known as tank descent. Soviet armored vehicles, including the T-34-85 and the IS-2 heavy tank, had welded turret handrails that riders used for grip during transit and the approach to contact. No radio was needed because the riders and the crew shared the same vehicle, and direction could be given by direct voice at close range. The cost was paid in infantry blood. Men riding exposed on the exterior of a tank under artillery, mortar, and small arms fire suffered severe casualties. Soviet tank descent worked, and it was purchased at exactly the price its exposure deserved. The American external tank telephone was different from both of these approaches in a specific and important way. It did not require infantry to mount the vehicle and expose themselves to fire. It did not require a specially equipped carrier with an integrated radio network. It left the infantryman on foot, using terrain for cover, able to communicate with the crew precisely at the moment and for exactly the duration that communication was needed. The phone changed nothing about the tactical position of either element. It simply allowed two men already fighting in the same space to speak to one another. That precision of fit between problem and solution is what allowed it to become theatre-wide standard in 30 days. By the time Operation Cobra launched on July 25th of 1944, the external tank telephone was in place across the separate tank battalions of the United States First Army. The operation opened with one of the largest aerial bombardments in support of a ground assault in the history of the war to that point, with more than 2,000 American aircraft dropping ordnance on a narrow corridor south of the St. Lo Road, targeting the Panzer Division and the other formations of the German 7th Army. When the American infantry and armor moved forward through the smoke and the craters, they moved with the capability that had not existed a month earlier. They could talk to each other in the moments that mattered. The results were immediate. Panzer Division, already badly damaged by the aerial bombardment, was effectively destroyed in the opening days of the operation. Fritz Bayerlein's own accounts from those days describe the experience of facing American combined arms teams that responded and adjusted with a speed and consistency that his previous encounters with American forces had not prepared him to expect. The German defensive line in Normandy broke, and the exploitation that American planners had been working toward since the invasion began finally materialized. The breakout from Normandy, the drive across France, and the race toward the German frontier followed in rapid succession as American combined arms teams moved with a coherence that the German army could not match. The phone traveled with American forces through the rest of the European campaign. In the dense forests of the Hurtgen in the autumn of 1944, where close terrain again compressed the battlefield and put tank infantry coordination at a premium, the modification continued to deliver what it had been designed to deliver. When the Battle of the Bulge opened in December of 1944, and German armoured formations drove deep into the American lines through the Ardennes, the 743rd Tank Battalion fought the 1st SS Panzer Division in the sector around Malmedy, Stavelot, La Glaise, and Stommel. The close-quarters combat in those Belgian towns placed exactly the demand on direct tank infantry communication that the Bocage had, and the phone was there. The 761st Tank Battalion, the African-American unit that fought under the name the Black Panthers, entered combat in France in November of 1944 and served with General Patton's Third Army through the end of the war, supporting the 26th, 87th, and other infantry divisions as Third Army drove into the heart of Germany. Its Shermans carried the same modification the whole theatre had adopted, and its crews and the infantry they supported used it in the same fights where the outcome of the war was being decided. The phone served whoever needed it. In the Pacific, the United States Marine Corps had arrived at the same solution through a parallel course of experience. Marine tank battalions operating in the Central Pacific from late 1943 had developed tank infantry telephone kits through the fighting on Roy Namur and Saipan. The 4th Marine Tank Battalion's records from the Saipan operation in June of 1944 describe telephone installations connecting Sherman tanks directly to the infantry working beside them, built on the same basic principle that had appeared independently in the Bocage. The same units refined the technique further on Tinian, and by the assaults on Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945, Marine combined arms teams were using the phone specifically to counter Japanese close assault demolition teams, infantry units trained to approach tanks from the rear and flanks, attach magnetic charges to the hull, and detonate them. The ability of the foot soldiers around each tank to warn the crew by voice in real time was the direct answer to a threat that had caused severe tank losses in earlier operations where that communication had been absent. After the war, the Army formalized the improvisation. The Signal Corps standardized the modification as the Interphone Extension Kit RC-298. The package included an external control box, designated the BC-1362, designed to accept a standard handset with binding posts that could also accommodate the EE8 field telephone, and a connecting cord designated CO213. The technical manual governing installation was TM11703. The post-war design placed the unit on the right rear of the hull at a height calibrated for a standing soldier, somewhat better positioned than some of the wartime field expedients. The electrical architecture was also refined. The wartime installations had typically connected the external phone directly into the crew interphone bus, so that everything the crew said was audible to the soldier outside. The standardized kit introduced a dedicated control box that the crew could operate independently, giving the tank commander the ability to open or close the external connection without disrupting internal communication during the most demanding moments of an engagement. The General Board of the United States Forces European Theatre, which produced systematic assessments of the campaign's lessons in the months after the fighting ended, addressed the tank infantry coordination problem explicitly in its post-war studies. Study number 51, examining the employment of armor, recommended integrating a tank regiment into every infantry division as a permanent organizational element so that armor and infantry would train together, develop shared procedures over years rather than days, and fight together as a coherent combined arms team rather than the improvised attachments the separate tank battalion system had produced. It was the structural recommendation that the experience of the bocage and the costs of the coordination failures had made unavoidable. The phone had addressed the technological gap. Only organizational integration could address the training gap that had required the phone in the first place. The General Board's recommendation reflected an understanding that the phone, for all its value, was a compensatory measure. It was a technical solution to a problem that was fundamentally organizational. Two combat arms that trained separately and fought together only when circumstances required, it would always need some improvised bridge to close the gap that their separation had opened. The phone closed it technologically. But the more durable solution was the one that did not require a bridge at all, which meant placing the armor and the infantry in the same formation from the beginning, giving them years of shared training rather than days or weeks of rushed familiarization before contact. The board's recommendation was eventually absorbed into the doctrine of the Integrated Combined Arms Battalion, though it took decades and the lessons of Korea and Vietnam to complete that transition. The 1949 edition of Field Manual 1733, the Army's post-war Tank Battalion Manual, addressed communication between dismounted infantry and supporting armor directly, formalizing the use of the external interphone on each tank as the standard means of direct conversation between a soldier on the ground and the crew inside. The language in those pages was the product of 4 years of hard experience distilled into doctrine. The principle of the external phone survived every generation of American armor that followed. It traveled from the Sherman through the M48, the M60, and the M60A3, the successive main battle tanks of the Cold War. When the M1 Abrams entered service in the early 1980s, the external phone was absent from the design. Neither the original M1 nor the M1A1 nor the baseline M1A2 that followed it carried the fitting. Infantry commanders who had trained with it on older vehicles raised the issue persistently, understanding what its absence meant in the close terrain where infantry and armor would fight together. The phone was eventually returned in 2 stages. The Tank Urban Survival Kit, ordered in 2006 for use in the urban fighting in Iraq, included an infantry telephone as one of its 5 standard components. The modification was then standardized on the M1A2 System Enhancement Package version 2, contracted in 2007 and fielded from 2008 onward. A field expedient born in a Norman hedgerow in the summer of 1944 had outlasted 2 generations of American main battle tanks before it found its way back to the hull where it belonged. There is a space between the institutional army of 1944 and the men who solved its most costly tactical failure overnight, with a drill and a length of wire. That space appears in every military organization in every era, the gap between the doctrine written before the fighting begins and the reality encountered by the soldiers who do the fighting. What differs is not the existence of that gap, but the speed and conditions under which it closes. The solution that emerged from the 743rd Tank Battalion's workshops moved from prototype to theatre standard in 30 days, because a specific combination of circumstances allowed a bottom-up answer to move upward faster than any top-down directive could have managed. It required nothing new. It demanded no procurement, no factory, no approval chain, and no board of evaluation. It required soldiers who could see the problem clearly, recognized the tools available to address it, and acted on that recognition before another rifle platoon paid the price of waiting. The soldiers who used the phone in the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes were not thinking about institutional reform when they cranked the magneto. They were thinking about the machine gun at the hedgerow and the 2 seconds available before it displaced. The phone gave them those 2 seconds. It gave the man crouching behind the hull a voice, and the man in the turret a direction, and it turned 2 capable soldiers who had been fighting in the same space without being able to help each other into something the German defenders they faced found steadily harder to stop. What deserves to be carried forward from this history is not the technical description of an ammunition can and a field telephone, equipment long superseded by encrypted digital networks that would have been unimaginable in a Norman field. What deserves to be carried forward is the clarity of the problem as those men lived it. Two people fighting in the same space, unable to communicate, paying for that inability with their lives. And the recognition, arrived at before dawn by men with equipment already on hand, that the answer had been available for 2 years. It had been reported. It had been acknowledged. It had been filed and not acted upon. The external tank telephone is not a monument to American ingenuity. It is a monument to the price soldiers pay when institutions move slower than the problems those soldiers are dying to solve. And it is a permanent record of what determined men do when the institution, for whatever reason, has not done it first. It is also a record of the men who insisted on that lesson long after the war was over, who complained about the missing phone on the M1 Abrams as clearly as they could, and who proved in doing so that the most useful military knowledge is the kind that survives the men who earned it.